right, my name is Dan. I wanted to give a quick look at what to expect in the Prophet of Edan or in the Edan Trilogy. If you haven't read the books, you're more than welcome still to stick around. I'm not going to spoil everything for you, but I think some people will go into the trilogy with some level of hesitancy, and I think that's fine. Like for me, when I was trying to change my taste or branch out in different genres, I went to YouTube and I thought maybe I'll go into fantasy more because I was more into like the classics and some other things, historical nonfiction or historical fiction. And I found Philip Chase among other people, and Malazan was one of the big ones that kind of I thought this is interesting and very different from what I'm used to. Like I didn't do a lot of multi-book difficult reads like that, and I decided to go right into Malazan amongst some other things, and it just hooked me. And from that I talked to Philip Chase, and so I knew him. I knew of him for a couple months before I talked to him and before I read the book. But it's clear that a lot of people, he had a fan base before, he had a fan base to give the book to. And so that's kind of a lucky thing to have. And I don't know if maybe that would skew some people's opinions on it. I don't think like it's wrong to have, if you like the guy, you're more likely to like the book, I'm sure. And I really like the guy, but I want to give my honest review about how my kind of experience has been with the trilogy so far. So, when I read The Way of Edan, I actually read this one twice. I read it, and then I was, I got invited to talk to Philip Chase, and so I kind of burned through it again really quick because I was a little bit nervous about, I don't do these interviews and things. I didn't want him to ask me like questions. Like he's a teacher. I didn't want him to ask me questions, and I didn't know it of his book. And so I did that twice, and I really liked it. I didn't go on the internet and just say this is like the next greatest thing under the sun, but I did like it. It has the POV of a person named Dayraven who lives in the Mark. And some of this book, it very much is a prologue book going into the series where he's basically exiled for this thing that happens to him. And he's exiled and he has to kind of make his own way. And he has this special thing about it. And one of the very, I'll just say one of the very things that does capture me, and mostly capture me in this book, has to do with the magic and sort of the lore of what's happening. It's clear that in this continent, he loves Malazan, and in Malazan it's like hundreds of thousands of years of history that is beneath their feet, and they're always just kind of uncovering it, but it's like layers upon layers of lore and history, some of it forgotten, some of it very skewed. You have these different kingdoms, and they all have a little bit of a different interpretation of how things have gone down in the past, and I'm a sucker for that sort of thing. So that was one of the things that hooked me. It has it is kind of a classical fantasy vibe, but before you think that maybe this is like, we've seen this a million times, just another classic fantasy thing, I will say no. Even though maybe the first book feels a little bit like that, like it's building into something like that, it does have this Eastern quality to the magic system. Think more like a Jedi, something where it's more internal and about your kind of interfacing with whatever energy is out there. Sometimes we have these books about the gods or about one god or whatever. We have these different mythologies. A lot of Eastern mythologies, it's almost more about this balance and interfacing with with oneself and whatever. And that's kind of how our main character is sort of interfacing. And when with these other priests and whoever who are able to interface with the magic, it's sort of that sort of thing. And some people will feel like they're kind of connecting with an energy, and some people will feel like they're connecting with an ancient deity. And it's interesting, and I really like that sort of thing in books. But it's very interesting that we have these different sorts of Eastern qualities. But that being said, man, you can see a lot of like Viking or Celtic Germanic sort of inspired stuff here. That's a part of his history. And he wears some of his inspirations on his sleeve, but in the best possible ways. I think, I see a lot of, there are some tropey things that happen. You can also see, especially in the second book, in my opinion, where, some of the Tolkien influence sort of comes out, especially maybe when it comes to some of the battles and some of the sequences. And so the first book kind of moves you along, but it's much more low level or low stakes, even though there are major things happening. It kind of builds towards this kingdom that's trying to expand and take over the whole continent. And so the first book, it seems like we're kind of going to get to that. It seems like we're going to get to more of the magic, kind of a training montage thing, but it's very much building up towards what we get in book 2. And so I read book 2, and I really, this is where it's at. When it comes to the trilogy so far, I haven't read the third book. But just like book 1, I've actually read book 2 twice. And it's a very different kind of book. Now, like, I am legitimately a fan of book 2. I liked book 1 enough to go to book 2. And I figured, I hoped book 2, some of the stuff that we get in book 2, I was hoping that we would get there in book 1, to be honest. But I will just say that I think people should read at least to book 2. And then at that point, I don't think most people will think that it's just another, kind of another basic medieval fantasy sort of story. I honestly don't think that. And so I think Philip is, when I'm reading the first book, it's hard because as you're reading the first book, you always have that thing in the back of your mind that says, okay, this is a self-published author. This is, we see him on YouTube. Like, okay, I'm looking for the things that are telling me that this isn't worth reading. I'm looking for that sort of stuff. Like, it's just kind of in the back of your mind as you're, it just happens. And I think if he actually nails the landing in this last book, which I'm about to go into, if he nails the landing, I think this book or this trilogy is going to gain its legs when it starts expanding outward away from people that are already fans of his on BookTube and listen to his, I think that's where it will get legs. And after book 2 with the Prophet of Edan, I think it does have that possibility to really expand and become something that people really, really like at a more wide scale. I'm not sure. I haven't looked at reviews on how people rate these 2 books, but I think book 2 is just everything that I was hoping it to be. So, some stuff that I think shines in the series and especially in book 2. I think these kingdoms, I can't think of another book that does wargaming in a way that is so visual and vivid between these different kingdoms. Now, I haven't read things like A Song of Ice and Fire, but I imagine that there is some of that, a Game of Thrones. It makes me wonder if this is the sort of influence that he kind of brought in for this, because he really did a good job. There's been some other books that have done this too, but he does a great job in making the Torlanders or whatever different from these kind of southwestern Western kingdoms, and especially Asdralad. And then in, the first book kind of is this Western sort of area. But in the second book, he just opens it up. And not only opens it up in scope, where we get these Western kingdoms, and like these are very much kind of tribal and clan like, and I think kind of almost like these old Germanic sort of kingdoms. Maybe not. I'm probably getting that influence wrong, but these big, hardy, often northern people in these types of books. And we open that up, and they have a very rich history that it seems like it's a rich history, and their struggles between themselves, and also in the first book, obviously, the struggles between like these kingdoms. And we see these very prideful kings at times in a couple of these places, as they are clashing and wishing to expand. But also, one of my favorite portions of this, what has so grown on me, and the reason why I read The Prophet of Edan twice before going into Return of Edan, because I love that we have this wide variety of really well fleshed out kings and leaders within all of these. I'm thinking of the king, King Bulk. That was his name. We have the queen from Asdralad. We have kind of the duke or king here. Get him a little less. Obviously, King. I don't say these names out loud, so I have no idea how to pronounce them. Yorkemwald or something. I have no idea. He's bananas. The king from Elland, amazing. We have the Thrors, the big tall dudes up here, where really cool history of stuff here, especially as it's kind of like a land dispute. Very, very cool. I loved that. And then we have these different kind of tribal, I think of like, in book 2, I can't even say it, but it like reminds me of how, sometimes we have these, it reminds me of like the Peloponnesian Wars or something like that, with people banding together at times. Very, very cool. The kind of the war leaders up here. There's another king in Sildaran. Stuff happening with Golgar and Sundara, and it's just these layers of how, or these layers of history of how there's just been so much that has led people to have their opinions of how, their traditions and cultures and opinions and their clashes and blood feuds and all those. And I think that he really, really, really does an excellent job at that. And as we're going through book 2, I kept looking at this map, and I can't think, and I'm honest about this, I can't think of another book that had me looking at a map quite as much, because I was just enjoying the wargaming elements of how people were moving around, and how maybe it would bounce to another POV of another kingdom, and kind of what they're thinking and their rationale for certain things. There is clearly some good versus evil in this, obviously, but I do like that not everyone, everyone's going into things with their own biases and clashes and access to magic and whatever. And I think it's really, really good, and I really, really enjoyed it, and I was a legitimate fan of book 2, and that's why I'm here. I wasn't going to do this until I finished book 3, but I thought, it's been so long, and I might as well grant those roses. So, Some of the other things, obviously, the magic system is fantastic. I think it is not exactly what we would expect. I think with a lot of self-published, I think people have to go and find their voice a little bit as they're trying to write. I know for me, a lot of the times, like the reason I have all these books behind me is because I'm trying to find things in, I try to echo or mimic some things and find what really sticks. And I think for sure in book two is where I go away from thinking, oh, this is a self published author who's desperate for me to buy his book, desperate for us to like his book. So he sells. Well, that's when I just got sucked into the story and thought, oh, Philip is actually good at this. He's actually great at this. And this is really fantastic. I became a fan, a legitimate fan of the series, at least, in book two, and I'm so excited to go to book three. I do have some notes, but I guess in short, like I would totally recommend it, but recommend people for sure, try out book one, and if you think there's something there, I guarantee you, I mean, in my opinion, that book two will just expand on, the stakes and expand on the people and make you love the people. Holy smokes. Even though there are lots of big moments and exciting action scenes, the small moments are so great and so filled with heart. And I like his sensibility in being able to handle, some romantic things and humor and struggle and grief. Like, I think he did a really great job. I sincerely do. So, some other things, if you don't mind some dead air, but I think the quality definitely goes up. I don't think it was like, I imagine that book two here is kind of the story, I mean, it's all the story, but this is where it really lifts off for me. And I imagine it's tricky to get a good book two in. So I mentioned the war game. The stakes are really high. It's very Eastern. I didn't get to read Lord of the Rings before I watched the movies, and so I didn't exactly get that original Lord of the Rings experience. I did with The Hobbit, and I read The Hobbit before the movies, but I didn't get that excitement of reading the books, not knowing where it's going. Like, I've read it since, and I still think it's great, but I didn't really get that classic sort of thing. And I get some moments. I'm not trying to say, oh, he's the next Tolkien. I'm not saying that, and I'm not saying he isn't that. I'm just saying that there are some moments, think of like Helm's Deep, and some things like that give me chills when I'm watching the movies or now watching the books, that I can only imagine if I could have read the book first and got to that moment. There are some moments like that in book two that just kind of give me chills and really, really were exciting. And I think, I finally got that kind of feeling. I'd get that obviously in Malazan and a lot of books, but in a thing that's very contained within this continent, it's great. One of the reasons I didn't go to book three yet also is it does give a quite satisfying ending, sort of, in book two, where some of the conflict from book one and book two is kind of resolved, but it does leave some glaring questions, which I can't really get into unless we go into a spoiler talk. But it goes into some very glaring questions, especially regarding this magic. And like, what if? Anyway, I can't even go into that. But I'd love to do a full spoiler talk. But it does definitely need to have a book three to tackle some of those things that are still on my mind, even though we've handled some of the conflicts of book two, obviously not all of them. let's see. I think the quality was quite steady and jumped up obviously in book 2. It it did successfully deepen how much I care for the characters. That's why I read book 2 again. I was just going to read the ending before, the last 150 pages because they're just amazing. But the 150 pages before going into Return, and then I thought, well, I'll just read the whole dang thing again. But I really, really like it. And so let's see. The variety of kings and queens are just amazing. The different races and the conflict between like the dwarf type of characters, even though they're called like the dwargs, and the Thoths or whatever. So awesome. And I can obviously honestly say that a couple of my favorite characters of like since reading fantasy, one of them specifically, Orvandil, he's like maybe my favorite like badass character in any of these kinds of books. I think he's just he's one of my favorite characters. I think he's awesome in book 2. Let's see. I talked about the pursuit of, I like that they have different, we have these creation myths in a lot of these stories, and he's kind of created his own creation sort of origin story. And I like ones that kind of tackle that sort of thing. I'm just a sucker for that sort of thing, and this scratches that itch. The relationships are genuinely good in this. I think they're really good. So anyway, I don't know if I need to say much more. I don't know, I don't know if Philip feels like he needs to get on with a publisher to write like another trilogy or write anything else. I hope he doesn't feel like he needs to, because I can only imagine, this took a lot of years. This was a labor of love, and I don't know if something with this quality and depth would just kind of be forced. He'd have to. I don't know. I imagine he needed a lot of time to ponder and live in this world and really get to know it, because it really comes through in the pages. And I don't know if, hopefully we get in a world where we can see, we don't have to worry about self-published stuff that has taken people a long time to read. Obviously, there's like a we rely on stuff being published getting over that bar, that quality bar or whatever. But if he takes his time and takes another 10 years doing whatever, I think better on him if he wants to do it that way. But I hope that he will write more. I'm really hoping he sticks this landing, because I sure loved book 2, and I don't want to be disappointed with book 3. But I really, 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 really liked book 2, and sincerely, I know he'll probably watch this, because he probably watches a lot of different reviews and things, and I think he should be really proud of this. And if he just wanted to have somebody really love his kingdom and his world and his story as much as he does, obviously he'll probably love it. He loves it more than anyone, but he has definitely made me a fan of this story, and I'm invested with certainly a few of these major characters. I don't think it's a ripoff of like Tolkien or any other things. It kind of wears its, like I said, it wears its inspiration on its sleeve at times, but it's not like we're going across the world to destroy an artifact, which we've seen that 100 times. So anyway, really, really good, and I hope people will give this a try. So talk to you later.